Are there any like weird structures under the water around Trinidad?
I mean, I'm not very familiar with diving around Trinidad. I
Right.
like the clear waters. So not that I know of. I know that like there are like ancient reefs like on the East Coast, and a lot of like free divers and fishermen and people that work in oil and gas. They talk about those ancient structures, and I think those reefs sort of line up with the Central Range,
Right.
and it goes off into the water. So you get those mounds underwater, which have these pockets of marine life and whatnot. But I don't know about like archaeological sites.
Structures like
No,
a pyramid or something. But
I wish.
no, but yeah, that would be cool. When you say ancient reefs, what is that? What constitutes an ancient reef?
Oh my gosh, that's another very good question. I think so. Our reefs I would say it was so Caribbean reefs were born, I think, I'm terrible at numbers, but 2 to 3 million years ago, and that's when like the Isthmus of Panama was formed, right?
Right.
And so that merged South America and North America, and that created all sorts of um, destructions in the ocean because of change in ocean circulation. So our reefs are, our reefs have changed from them and from that time, and it has evolved. And I would think modern reefs are about 6,000 to 8,000 years old, because it had to come back from that mass destructive event. So I would say those ancient reefs would have been when the water was a little bit shallower, sea level was lower.
Well,
We
much
probably
lower,
were
yeah.
like connected to South America.
I was just going to bring that up.
Yeah.
Because I think there's a Younger Dryas event, and that took place, I think, 12,000 years ago. And that rose, or what the theory is that it rose sea levels because of mass ice cap melting and all of the destruction that comes with that. But between Trinidad and Venezuela would have been probably paths that could have been walked across when the sea levels were lower. So I guess it would have to be after that period.
Yeah.
How long does coral take to grow? It probably varies from place to place.
Yeah, but then there's the coral, and then there's the reef, right? So the reef is, a collection of corals growing together and building up over hundreds to thousands of years. So like the Great Barrier Reef is one example of an 8,000-year-old reef that is, where the barrier reef was originally where was the coastline of Australia, right? And then sea level rose, and then the barrier reef kept growing to compete with sea level rise. And so you would be 40 kilometers from the coast and you have that reef system. So it's the living system is very different from the history that it grows on. So
Right.
I won't be able to tell you the numbers.
Yeah, no, that's fine. So I mean, you're an ecologist, but focusing on coral reefs specifically?
Yes. So I mean, I enjoy, like, ecology is the relationship between the biology, the physical, and the chemical, right, on the planet. And I chose coral reefs. Well, it was accidental, but I'm not very good at identifying things. I like to understand the patterns of communities and populations and see how these patterns change with environment or change with human influence and whatnot. So I'm not good at identification. I'm not a taxonomist, but I do enjoy. I'm a coral reef ecologist. So yeah.
And growing up on an island helped? I mean, there's water everywhere around us.
I mean, I have the typical island upbringing, right? I mean, I guess there's still very few of us, we're all islanders, but yeah, snorkeling down the islands. My grandfather, he raced boats and he was a fisherman, and so we go down to Scotland Bay a lot, and he would take me snorkeling. I think that was sort of my first insight to like, hey, I like being outdoors. I like being in the marine environment and seeing, because he gave me a mask so I could see below the water and whatnot. And I just enjoyed being out in the water. And it was not necessarily the technical, like the organism, it's just not being in an office, right? And I like science. And it's like, what are the options? Engineer, doctor, marine biologist. I actually wanted to it was between physics and biology because I wanted to do like study prosthetics, like
Yeah.
be like biomechanical prosthetics, not just the non-functioning. And I was very interested in making that, but then I was like, it's too much math, so I chose I chose biology, and I think I chose well.
No, that's awesome. I mean, I want to get a little crash course in coral reefs for a second. We always, I mean, when I look around, especially in like everything from cartoons to movies and whatnot, coral reef coral takes, I mean, so many different shapes, colors, forms. Is there a definitive number on how many different types of coral out there are there? And do all of them exist in, say, Trinidad's waters?
Oh gosh, that's a good that's a very good statement in terms of like a lot of what we know and what we don't know about corals and coral reefs. So we like and based on physiological traits, not like molecular traits, which a lot of organisms are being reassessed based on their molecular, you know, DNA and whatnot. And so that's changing taxonomy a lot. But based on sort of traditional taxonomy in Australia and in the Pacific areas, like where it's probably the sort of the origin of coral reefs, where they have suitable geography and whatnot, and those areas you would have 400 to 600 species of reef building corals, right? If you come to the Caribbean, which is a much younger system, the Caribbean Sea Basin was formed, as I said, only a couple million years ago. That system, in our system, we have close to, less than 100 species.
Wow.
You come down to Trinidad and Tobago, and we have less than 50 reef building species. So it gets, it is very, very environmental specific.
Does coral reef, is coral reef transplanting a thing?
What do you mean, naturally or like by
No,
humans?
artificially, yeah, artificially.
Yes, but we tend to try and stick to the regions where the corals are native to. So you don't want to introduce corals to the process of coral transplanting is used through restoration, and it's usually done locally to sort of revive local populations.
The existing population. So we won't, is not to say like if we have 50 species of coral, we're not going to see new species of coral introduced because that might offset.
I mean, it depends on what time scale you're talking about.
Right.
So there may be corals. There are there are non-native corals that have come to the Caribbean. They're the sun-cup corals and whatnot, and they don't pose any damage. But all our corals are unique to the Caribbean. There's zero overlap between our corals and the corals of the Pacific or of the Red Sea.
It's specific to the region.
Yeah.
Because what they've presumably developed over they've
evolved, in a completely different environment and whatnot. So physically, they may look similar to a coral in the Pacific, but genetically, they'll be very different.
Tell me, so, I mean, you came with some literature for me to take a look at. The first book was published in 1991, and the second book was published this year, between 2024 2025.
Mm-hmm.
And then you gave me you kind of skimmed over a little fun fact that there has not been a lot of coral reef books in between, if any. I mean, besides the obvious, why is that? I mean, considering we are a tropical island and we have what might be the largest brain coral in the world.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, why isn't this? I mean, do we want this to be a tourist destination, or do we not want this to be a tourist destination? Speaking to an ecologist.
Yeah, I think in terms of the diving community, Tobago is definitely a tourism destination. The niche market is there, and in fact, it was much more popular during the early 90s, early 2000s, and then it died out. And so I think it was in the 1980s where, was it under NER, where they were bringing back, building the economy, and they pushed a lot of tourism in Tobago, and that was the peak in terms of like diving, in terms of visitors to the island. And now it's actually at a low, especially after COVID. And so it's within the diving community, Tobago is known to be very a one of a kind sort of diving destination. And after I've done a lot of diving around the world, I did my studies in Florida, in Curacao, in Australia, and looking at all those reefs and, going to the Great Barrier Reef, seeing those reef systems. I didn't expect much coming back home to Tobago, right? But I was actually very surprised at how beautiful and unique I cannot equate our reefs to anything else. It is unique and beautiful in its own right.
And if you're saying our reef was formed 2 to 3 million years ago, and I know we don't need specifics, but about how old is this? You can reshift, you can fix this if you want. Just because your hair is getting caught on the.
Is
on
that
the top.
it? Yeah.
Let me
just take it out.
And then push it back. That might be better. Yeah. And how old? So just to take that back, we spoke about you spoke about our reef kind of forming over 2-3 million years, and don't need any specific numbers, but if we might have the largest brain coral in the world, how old would this brain coral be?
So I think the most conservative estimates would be about 300, but the less conservative can be closer to 1,000 years, right?
So sometime in between there, because a lot of things might affect it in terms of the rate of growth and stuff like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, looking at the history, I've paralleled it to like our history. 300 years ago, there were slave ships coming across the Atlantic. We were being fought over by Europe and whatnot. And so, and it's only until World War II, where scuba was really invented, that people used scuba diving gear to start exploring reefs around the world. So Cousteau visited a lot of reefs. And so imagine World War II. So this coral is over several hundred years old already before we even discover it, right? And I think that, corals grow, the rate of growth depends on things like rainfall. It depends on, how much disturbance it's experiencing. And what I do imagine is that coral probably grew a lot in its early couple hundred years, but it may have slowed down,
True.
And it has suffered a lot in the last 50 years. There's, you look at that image, and that image was taken in 2018. There's a big yellow sponge coming out of it now, that's 5 years later.
Really?
Yeah. So it's dealing with a lot, especially in recent history.
Is sponge good or bad?
Depends, and I think
on where it chooses to grow.
Yeah, because it can erode the skeleton, and it's growing out of the skeleton. So it basically it's sort of like it's eroding the skeleton around it.
Wow.
So
when you say skeleton
of the coral,
the brain coral.
Yes.
So does that mean that parts of it have already died?
There are sections, even when I visited, 5-6 years ago, that have died and not recovered. But that is also part of a coral's life, right? It's not, it's not all perfect. There is competition. Parts will die, parts will get disease, but it's sort of that balance of, good versus bad. If it continues to grow and adapt, a little loss here and there is not that bad,
And do things like, we know that man-made things, interference, can harm the coral. But what about things like hurricanes and storms?
Yeah, so that's a good question. But there are certain coral species that would be better adapted to strong wave action than others.
Right.
So if you take the elkhorn coral, it looks like elk horn, right? So the branching corals, they're found in the shallow reefs around the Caribbean, and they're actually they're the first exposed to like wave and storm surge. And they would fragment from that storm surge, but those fragments will grow into bigger thickets of corals, right? So there's a happy medium or a type of adaptation, right? So you find those in that wave exposed environment because they grow quickly, they grow from fragments, and that's how they survive.
It's kind of like it has like the cassava of Coral Reef.
Yes.
I remember just random story. I remember a guy. I think it was a yard sale, and a guy asked me if I plant things, and I was like, yeah, sure. And he handed me a cutting of cassava, and I forgot about it for weeks, and it was just a dry stick in the garage. And then I remembered, and I thought, let me plant it. And this is weeks later after he gave it to me. Presumably, he had cut it recently, and I stuck it in the ground, and it just started to
Yeah,
the
resilient.
next day
Yeah.
it just started to grow. So these, is it, I mean, it might be difficult, but is it this one?
No, it's let me
Yeah,
show you.
let's go through this book.
This is actually staghorn, which is the finer branch coral that you find in Buku.
We probably take some pictures. I'll probably just take some pictures with my phone and put it up on the screen.
I wish I could have a bigger photo, but this is the elkhorn that I'm talking about. And these are the thickets you find in Buku.
That is so cool. And it's kind of looks a little furry. That's why it's...
It's more bumpy. Yeah,
Oh, okay,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Elkhorn coral.
Yeah. Our naming conventions are very
This guy
basic.
Right. This guy right here. We'll try and put up a picture. This kind of shows where different coral...
Exactly. So you'll get the more, the high density skeleton, the stronger branchings closer to the wave action.
Which would be more shallow.
Yeah. And then as you go down, because they depend on light, they kind of flatten out like solar panels because they need more space.
Surface area for the light.
Exactly.
Now, as all coral, you were telling me, I can't remember if it was before the cameras were rolling, you were telling me that it's kind of like a symbiotic relationship with coral and algae.
Yes.
Is that true for all coral?
No. So these are corals that are adapted to shallow environments. They like the tropics. They like low nutrient environments. And in those environments, evolutionary, they have evolved a symbiotic relationship with the type of algae. And basically, the algae lives in the coral's tissue. It's the reason why the corals get those fabulous colors of greens and blues and purples and reds. And the algae, it's like a hotel for the algae, right? They don't get eaten. They don't have to fend off or move around as much. They sit in the coral. They get the sunlight because the coral's tissues are transparent. And so they photosynthesize, they get food, and they basically pay rent to the coral host. The host gets a significant amount of rent. They grow really, really big. And in return, they sort of, provide with essential nutrients, remove their waste kind of thing. And so that's sort of like the really happy relationship between the coral host. I mean, and so a coral is related to jellyfish. Right?
So that was literally my next question is that what is coral? Yeah. It's living, I mean, I'm going to be super primitive here. It is living rock.
Yeah, so it is, I like to describe it as a cousin of the jellyfish. Instead of drifting around in the water column, in this translucent kind of body, it settles in one spot and it grows a skeleton. And basically, if you zoom into that coral and you zoom in, you can see the polyps, which is an individual coral. And that has sort of the tentacles, which sort of, highlight that it's a jellyfish. I'll show you here.
So then, like, the brain coral would be made up of
millions of these little tiny guys. So that's sort of a single polyp of a coral, and then they sort of multiply.
Just to show everybody, even though I'm going to try and take pictures and put it up.
And then if you go to the life cycle, they kind of grow more and more, and so you basically get a structure, and then they reproduce.
And how do they stick?
Cement. So yeah, they produce their own sort of glue adhesive. Yeah, and they like areas that are covered in sort of a coralline algae. So I don't know if you know that there's a pink algae that you would see on rocks underwater, and it's very, very, very common. They like that substrate. So it's all sort of, it's multiple symbioses that are happening.
I know these slimy rocks down the islands. No. These slimy green rocks, not those.
No. It's the pink. Have you ever seen a scorpion fish? Do you know scorpion fish are they actually have that pink.
They eat that algae, I'm assuming.
No, they camouflage in that algae.
Okay.
So you don't see it. It's very, very cryptic, and it's funny when you see a scorpion fish outside of that environment because it stands out completely, right? But then you realize it's a pink fish, or red fish,
So I'm looking at the brain coral on the cover. I'm just fascinated by this because it almost has like an underneath shelf, and it's like, would these parts grow down? Are these parts growing down and adding on?
Yeah, so they would sort of grow up and out. And so those shelves are natural, like caves for fish and turtles to live. And that's why coral reefs as an ecologist are very, very important, because they may lose a piece here and there. They may create a little alcove. They may create little,
Right.
Apartments, and so that's how it sort of accretes and gains territory around it. They compete with other corals. It's like turf war.
That's, I mean, I'm sure that's pretty fascinating. Going from area to area, like if you go back, if you dive in a spot this year and you dive next year, you guys can essentially determine what coral is fighting with who for space.
You can see it so you can see when corals are fighting with each other in terms of like, you can see the mucus when they're sort of in contact. Obviously it's very, very slow, that sort of turf war. Branching corals, you can see it. I know colleagues have done time lapses where they really speed up the rate, so you can actually view the coral as if it's a moving organism, right? Because we don't have enough time to look at it underwater.
Time lapses over weeks or months or whatever.
Exactly. And so you can see the tentacles of the jellyfish, of the coral, attacking the neighboring one, and then the other one sort of blowing up in response. And so they're really clever ways to view it,
So, which I guess now, I mean, you've spoken about, I guess, coral as a important part of the ecology for harboring fish, and of course the algae and of course the beauty and all that. I've heard, like, I want to kind of get a comparison here for myself. If we lose the bees, we lose plant, what do you call it again? Pollination. Mm-hmm. You lose the pollination of plants and crops and food and whatnot. If all of the coral was just disappeared from our waters, I mean, what's the first thing that we would notice? Fish.
A loss of life, yeah. So
you'd have like no fish in the water to fish.
Yeah, so corals, the famous statistic is that it makes up less than 1% of the ocean floor, but it houses more than 25% of all marine biodiversity of the ocean.
Wow.
Right? So yes, we lose the corals, we lose a lot of marine life. They are nursery grounds for young fish, lobsters, conch, you name it. There's so much marine life concentrated in that, between that 30 meters and 2 meters or 1 meter depth. There's so much life concentrated in those areas, and you have the corals to thank for that. And that's basically because they create that variability in structure. They create the buildings, right? So you can have high rises underwater where you can have how many schools of fish living around and among,
and crustaceans and eels,
exactly, and then the things that are grow on top of each other, and then the other sort of soft corals and sponges. So there's an immense amount. There really are underwater cities, as we like to say, right? Because that physical structure that coral provides really houses a lot,
And you're saying that's essentially between 30 meters and 2 meters.
So you can go down to, you have highlight environments, which is, well, I would say 0 because you have reef flats, but 0 meters to 30 meters are where our shallow reefs are, and where you have peak biodiversity. And then you have mesophotic reefs, which are low light reefs, which go from, I think, 30 to down to 150 meters. And then below 200 meters, there's no light in the ocean. It's just completely dark, which is about, I don't know, it's like over 60% of the ocean is just complete darkness.
Right.
But then most of the marine life is present in that, 0 to 50 meter area.
But, is there coral below 200 meters?
Yeah, so there's a different type of coral. I think you'd asked that before. I'd never answered. Is
right.
that, do all corals need sunlight or whatnot? So you have deep sea corals that produce the same skeleton, and they grow extremely slowly. They can grow down in the abyssal plains. I don't know exactly where because I don't study that, but they are very slow growing. They feed like jellyfish. They pick particulates out of the water column. They also create structure, but the structure there is nothing compared to, what we see in the shallows. It's kind of like an extreme version,
Because I guess, as you said, there's no light past 200 meters.
There's not much energy past,
And so that's why that's why they would grow so slowly.
Yeah. So they have to wait for what you call is marine snow. So anything that comes from the surface, so anything that dies in the light zone and falls is called marine snow. And that's sort of something that they feed on. And anything in the bottom of the ocean feeds on that kind of stuff.
So then it's some coral, maybe most coral, are they I don't know if this would be the same terms like carnivorous.
They're animals, so
So
yeah.
they eat
Well, they eat
the particulate,
particulate matter. Yeah.
which could be decomposed fish, could be all of those good stuff.
Yeah.
What about the algae themselves?
I guess if there's drifting algae, they would eat. I mean, our corals in the shallows, you can feed them brine shrimp. Like there are feeding programs you can feed corals.
Do you see the coral eating, or is it something they just?
Yeah, so like there's certain corals, like the mushroom corals. We don't have them in the Caribbean. And again, if you use a time lapse, it speeds it up so you can actually see it, pulling it in and whatnot. So it is, they are jellyfish. They can hunt, they can survive to a certain point through feeding to substitute, the light.
Are starfish anything?
They're, go ahead.
And brittle stars and those sorts of are they related?
No, so they're echinoderms, right? So it's cool that starfish, you chop them up and they create more starfish, right? Yeah. So they are the 5 body part or plane thing, but they're not related to jellyfish.
It's like looks like a living rock of some sort of.
Yeah, and they move around. They have tentacles that allow them to sort of move again slowly. A lot of the pace of the ocean is very different to that of us, right?
Yeah.
I guess. Nature is.
Yeah, it's just so fascinating. We get into this topic not too long, but I'm always reading about man-made disasters and how it affects. I mean, it's easy to hear about an oil spill, and then you hear the fishermen say, the fish are dying, and you're seeing fish literally floating in the oil and birds covered in oil. I've helped in oil spills, bring Dawn dishwashing detergent to wash them off. I guess it's a little bit more abstract of the damage that those sorts of things do to coral. Mm-hmm. Is it as immediate as what it happens with fish and birds? Whereas it's like a chemical in the water that changes the composition of the water. It kills certain things, and then those things, it just kind of cascades.
I think it's exactly that. So I personally have no experience of oil spills on corals. So I mean, last year we had that event where the tanker hit the reef in Tobago, and we were monitoring the nearshore environment. So a lot of it went into the mangroves, but fortunately not much had sunk onto the reef. Those reefs downstream seemed to fare better. What happens is that oil will float on the surface, and when it gets close to the coast, it'll hit the shallow reef areas, especially, low tide will bring the oil in contact. And you do get toxicity impacts, you get mortality, because obviously the oil will smother the polyps of the coral, so they can't function, they can't, so it is pretty devastating in itself, for the corals. And I mean, I won't know how to clean that up, because the corals are so, the living part of the coral is on the exterior of the skeleton. It's only a couple cells, thick.
And underneath that would be...
It's just the skeleton.
Skeleton. So it's like a fingernail, where it's just like, I guess, the opposite of a fingernail, where a fingernail is only the top is alive and the bottom is
all skeleton. So that coral that you're looking at, the living layer is just over that thin layer over the top of the skeleton.
And so which means that the whole thick of this thing is presumably feet and feet and feet thick.
No.
How big is this?
Oh, this. It's about, I would say 5 coral meters in diameter, maybe 3 meters high. About, yeah.
So this thing's huge.
Yeah. That's me in there, just a human reference, so it is big.
Are you swimming with that looks like a tripod. I know what a tripod looks like. Is that a camera?
Yeah. So I did a project that was, it's the famous term is a Google Street View underwater. So I worked on a project in Australia where we took 360-degree imagery of coral reefs of the Great Barrier Reef, Indonesia, Caribbean, and we basically use a lot of that for research. Like my PhD was looking at those images to get to derive information from those images, and I really wanted. Well, long story short, I really wanted our reefs to go on Street View as well, or to create a collection.
Absolutely.
And so I did a project here in Tobago. We took 360-degree imagery of obviously the big brain coral, of lots of sites around Tobago. And a lot of those are up on Google Street View. The others are collected on the Maritime Ocean Collection website.
So where can we see that? It's on Google Street View.
Yeah, so if you ever see any dots offshore, like little Tobago and stuff, you just take that little yellow guy and you drop them in, and you will be able to see that big brain coral.
All right. Well, I hope that people watching this will go and do a little Google Street View of because Google Street View, we don't get Google Street View in Trinidad.
No.
But we get it in with our coral reefs. And that sounds like an awesome program. Where else did you go? Indonesia, Australia?
Yeah, in Australia, Great Barrier Reef, we did several sites around there. Indonesia, Hawaii was another place. And then we did, the big project for me was also in the Caribbean, where we took a lot of, we took millions of images, because it's 3 cameras, and back then the 360-degree technology was not off the shelf. It was very, a lot of post-processing and
put
stuff.
it together.
So
What you've spent a lot of time underwater, presumably. What is the coolest thing you've seen underwater?
Oh my gosh.
I'm a little sad that it's not ancient civilization
No.
pyramid or something like that.
It's always got to be marine life. I think the far north Great Barrier Reef, it's very remote, very hard to get to, 300 kilometers from nowhere, and the Coral Sea is even further away from anything. I think those reefs were probably collectively the best reefs I've ever seen, and you'd go visit a reef that doesn't have a name, right? It's like Coral Key number, whatever. And you know that you're like one of a handful of people that are actually surveying this site. And so you roll over and there's a bunch of sharks that come up and look at you, and you're like, okay.
Because they also sleep in the coral and the caves.
They hang out on the reefs. It's their food source. It's their community. I like to think of sharks as like the governors and the police of the reef. It's like, I'll keep you in check, know? And they're very curious. So being able to dive in those sites where it's, I think, closest to the most pristine reefs I can have the opportunity to visit, where you have amazing fish life, you have curious sharks that just follow you around, and they, and it's just, they're like dogs, they just kind of follow you around.
Dogs with the sharpest teeth ever.
Yeah. I've had a bull shark follow me for one of my dives. We drive scooters. But the thing about it is, like, I have a scooter which makes me look super big. So I feel very confident when I'm driving that. But it's my safety driver who has a little scooter that's, that also has the bull shark behind him that's feeling quite, timid and whatnot. So I've had a lot of experiences, and I have a big respect for sharks. I'm not, they're predators for a reason. The other sort of amazing thing was in like whale sharks is something that I just thought was made up, because they don't exist. I just see them in magazines, and
they're huge.
They're huge. And we encountered one by chance. It wasn't like a whale shark dive. It was on the reef. And I just remember seeing this wall of fish coming towards me, and there's sort of like a cloud behind it, and you don't know what it is. And at that moment, you're like, this could be good or it could be bad, very bad.
Right.
And it's, you just have to wait and see. And it was, sure enough, a whale shark with, hundreds of fish around it, sort of, using the streamline of the whale shark to sort of glide and
also for protection. I mean, who wants to attack a fish that's next to a fish that's 20 meters
so they're
long?
just freeloading off of that whale shark.
I'll never forget, in primary school, I was also a science boy, and in primary school they were talking about some of the largest marine life, and one of the things that came about was the whale shark, and they could be 20 to 30 meters long, and they sent us outside to measure with a meter stick, to measure 20 meters and then 30 meters, just to get an understanding, a perspective of how big. And I will never forget, I literally remember 10 years old with a meter stick measuring 20 meters to and those things are massive.
Yeah.
And they only eat
krill.
What do they eat? Krill.
Yeah, plankton.
So they're not even studying you.
No.
But their but their mouths are big enough to swallow a human.
Yeah. So I think just don't be, in the wrong place. We had these tow lines that we tow GPS behind us so we can geolocate all the images. And so it was sort of a trying to get out of the way by, swimming as fast as possible
Yeah.
out of the way so we don't hook up on his fins or,
Oh, yes, that's true.
Yeah, so you don't go.
And then you'll be pulled
Yeah.
because he's not studying you.
Nah. So, yeah.
What
It was.
I was going to say, I mean, I was going to ask, like you said about the coral reefs off the coast of Australia being some of the most pristine that you've seen. Is it like walking into like a flower garden where you're almost overwhelmed by by the variety, by the colors, by the size of some of them?
Yeah, I wish you could say like a flower garden's like
Is like
nothing compared, like multiply that by 1,000, right? So like it's so much fish life where between you and me, I would lose you as a dive buddy because it's just huge schools of fish, endless, noise. It's a bit of a sensory overload. It's like everywhere you look, and I'm not even looking at the small stuff because that's just another world again. You have the pygmy seahorses, you have the nudibranchs that are like not as the tip of your finger that long, and so you have the micro world and you have the big world around you, and it's incredible. There was another dive opposite Rain Island. I don't know if you are familiar with Rain Island, but it's an island in North Great Barrier Reef, which is like the highest density nesting site for green turtles in the world. And we had the luxury of diving the reef opposite because nobody's allowed to dive on that island. And in that dive, we were surrounded by hundreds of green turtles, and they were just waiting to go. They were mating on the reef. And so, left and right. And some of them actually, would mistake you. Are you a turtle? Like,
oh, wow.
Looking, and we're just zooming by, and I remember distinctly, it was like an afternoon dive, and our deep sea team, they studied reefs, all mesophotic team. They're like, oh, we want to do a fun dive around here, where to go? And we're like, go to this site. You're going to see hundreds of turtles. And they went the next morning and they were all gone. And they were like, that was the worst dive ever.
Oh, it was like, so you're surrounded by hundreds, but then, they swim around the island or they...
But they basically, it was the timing. They were just waiting to go nesting. So they kind of were just hanging out at this adjacent reef.
It's like a pit stop, a rest stop.
Yeah, exactly. And they went nesting that night. And then the next morning, they're gone, or they're just hanging out somewhere else or foraging offshore. So it makes you realize that moment was, extra special,
I mean, I want to kind of go back to the animals that you encounter. Mm-hmm. I mean, this whale shark and the bull shark was following you. Have you ever seen a great white shark?
No, and I don't think I would ever want to.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I guess you could say I have a great respect for sharks as well. I don't have a lot of experience with them, but I respect them.
Yeah.
Just because I know what they can do. But that I wouldn't want to see a great white either.
So in the far north, there's saltwater crocodiles, right? And
far north where?
Far north, Queensland and Australia, and the Great Barrier Reef. And there was always the question, would you rather a saltwater crocodile or a great white shark? And hands down, I would take a great white shark any day because saltwater crocodiles are just assholes. They would just go after you, right? They would see you and they would want to kill you. Whereas, just because they are ancient,
predators.
Yeah.
I guess so are the sharks, but the sharks
sharks would they're in that environment because it's so clear. I've seen tigers, hammerheads, quite a few different shark species, and in those conditions, when it's not evening or hunting time, they're really just letting me see them, like they're curious and they are not out to like hunt you. So I've seen, I've been part of like feeding dives where I've seen that switch in a shark's behavior. And that's when I realized, oh, if they wanted me dead, they would. That's when the speed changes, their fins go down, and they get the speed. Oh, it's scary.
Like their movements are more intentional.
Oh, definitely. So when they're cruising around, they're like, I'm letting you see me,
Right, yeah.
And I'm checking you out, and that's it.
That's but like when you see in dives, like I've seen online, where it's a bunch of divers and then like this massive great white shark, 20-foot great, which just swims by. Yeah.
He's got no intention there, and a bit of But obviously, you have to be careful.
But being around it, you could
switches
see,
like that.
you can see
Yeah,
the
yeah,
attitude of a shark change.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that wouldn't be fun.
No. I mean, I'm saying I'm lucky to be able to see that. You know what I mean? Like, because if they are hunting, you probably would get, hit first before seeing anything at all. So
That's also true. I grew up in I spent a lot of my younger years in South Florida, and
yes.
alligators were just part of our, like, would be in the backyard, literally, like a 16-foot alligator in the backyard, and that is scary.
Yeah.
But being on land, like, you learn that you can outrun an alligator on land. But then, I mean, alligators and crocodiles, I'm lumping them together, even though I know the difference. But it terrifies me
Yeah.
that there's now saltwater crocodiles and even alligators that have found their way into the saltwater. They don't breathe via gills, so the saltwater doesn't, well,
For alligators, the salt water doesn't do them any good. But crocodiles
can manage.
Totally. They can swim. I don't think about the map of Australia and the northernmost tip. That's sort of where the far north Great Barrier Reef. They can swim thousands of kilometers down to central Australia, like Brisbane area, within a week or so, right?
Wow.
Or yeah. So they have relocated saltwater crocodiles from Brisbane to the far north, and the crocodile would just make its way back down. They are ultimate ocean predators.
That is scary. And then, which brings me back to now, brings me to the conversation of the killer whales off the coast of California.
What about South Africa?
Really? Are they? And they're going after, like, they kill sharks for fun off the coast of California. There's like a specific pod of killer whales that
one of it's
go
the
after,
A1.
go after sharks just for fun.
Yeah.
And they eat the liver.
Yeah. I heard that about South Africa, that it's the same thing. So like in Australia, whaling was huge back in the day, of course. It was the time. And they had a whale called Big Tom in South Australia that used to bring in the humpback whales. And he used to, bring in the whales for the whalers. And the respect of the whalers was that Big Tom could have the lips and the tongue of all the humpback whales he brought in. And then the whalers can have the blubber and everything. So It was a really and apparently Big Tom was very aggressive about it. He was the one that's like really, snapping at the fins of the humpback whales, really aggressively tying them out. So they're super intelligent, top of the food chain.
That's scary to me. How smart they are. That's actually scary to me. I would not want to be in the water with a dolphin. First of all, I don't want to be in the water with anything swimming bigger than me. I don't. But a dolphin, I feel like I wouldn't feel as scared. But if there was a killer whale, and I know that they have not been known to attack humans that I know of. But I would be terrified if there was a killer whale next to me in the water.
I don't want to test that theory.
I don't
know
want
what I mean? So, and I spend a lot of hours in the water. So I am actually very, I am a scaredy cat, believe it or not, right? So I like to look at my odds and I'll be like, the odds of an orca attacking a human would be higher with me than an average person. And I don't want to be that statistic. We had earlier this year, there's a pod of rough-toothed dolphins that hangs around Tobago. And we see them maybe every year, every other year. We'll go in the water and check them out. And this year, there was one dolphin that was less friendly than the others. And it didn't do anything. It was stayed at a distance. It had a different demeanor, and it was just cruising by. And I know there were young dolphins as well. So I figured it might have been, the pod leader or whatever. And my dive buddy and I were like, we both recognized it. It was just cruising in the back, very much like a shark, And so it can quickly change, right? And you just have to be mindful of that. Of course, I mean, I won't encourage people to go after dolphins to swim. You want to make sure that they come to you so you don't, harass them or whatever. And if they're feeling playful, then they would sort of interact with you, and they do that quite easily, but it is when you see them also change gears and swim very fast. We've had a couple that would dart right past us, and so we would go back by the boat just so we have sort of that
like a home base.
Yeah, so yeah, I have full respect for everything bigger than me and smaller than me.
I've seen dolphins many times down the islands, but I think quite often about a story that John Prokop, who was on an episode a few episodes ago, who swam from Tobago to Trinidad last year, and there was a dolphin that swam. Well, there were several dolphins, but there was one dolphin that he talks about specifically that just kept because he's in the middle of the water.
Yeah.
Dolphins, probably as smart as they are, they probably know we don't see humans swimming.
Yeah.
What's there,
Yeah.
And there was a boat next to him, of course, his support boat, but this dolphin swam with him for like 15, 20 minutes, just kind of like eyeing him, swim under, upside down, just kind of looking at him. And apparently, which John found out after, there was a pod on the other side of the boat swimming with them for like an hour.
Oh, wow.
And they were like just so curious as to what this man in the water was doing, and probably this boat next to him, and why aren't they helping him?
Yeah.
Who knows what?
I've had those encounters with dolphins underwater, because when we do the surveys, we're again on a scooter. And I remember it was in Belize, we were diving on a reef and we're coming up to depth to do our survey at that fixed depth. And we literally encountered a pod of dolphins. They were rolling around in soft corals and then kind of scraping their bodies, and like they were frolicking, and they didn't realize we were there. So we kind of encountered them, and they were like, oh. And so they followed us, and they would dip down, they'll look at you, with their eyes, they'll fall back. And I remember one sort of following my bubbles behind me. So it'll look and inspect me, and then because I'm breathing the air out, it'll sort of trail the bubbles behind me. But I also had that with manta rays as well. So and you don't think about that with mantas.
No.
And I remember distinctly in Australia, we were finishing one of our surveys, and about 4 mantas swam past us. And I was like, oh, survey's done. So I immediately just joined the line of the mantas. And there was one manta that was apparently behind me, sort of dipping down and checking me out. And and it was just letting me, so 3 mantas in front of me, then me, and then a manta behind me, and then my dive buddy. And we kind of just, I don't know where we were going. I know the surface, the surface support team had me because they could see me, but I was just going into the blue as far as I could just to hang out with them. And yeah, so they also have that curiosity, which you don't think about, right?
Those things are much bigger than dolphins, though.
They
can be much bigger than dolphins. Yeah. I remember once I was, I was about 17 or 18. I went fishing with some friends, and this is back in the day when a kiss butter bread and ole was lunch.
Yeah.
Put the ole inside the kiss butter bread. And I remember we were diving, and I saw a shadow, I felt a shadow over me, and I thought, oh, I'm underneath the boat. Let me swim to the side. I don't want to go up and hit the boat, or worse, or propeller, or whatever. And so I kind of look up and start to swim to the side, and I see wings.
Yeah,
It was massive.
Yeah.
It was way bigger than me. I was only probably down about 15, 20 feet. And this manta ray swam directly over me, probably between me and the boat. And I jumped out of the water so fast.
Yeah, I would understand.
I was terrified. The first time I ever saw a manta ray in person.
Oh, that's an awesome experience. Now that you survived
now,
it.
Now that I know, yeah. I don't think manta rays attack people. I hope they don't.
No,
but
they don't.
That would be, yeah. So, but yeah, those experiences, I haven't had a lot of experience with sea life, but.
It's funny you don't hear those stories anymore, because my grandfather had a similar, he would talk about, he'd be fishing down the islands in the Bocas, and underwater would just go completely black, and there'll be a manta underneath, so.
They're huge, 20, 30 foot wingspans. And
yeah, so they are the greater ones, the bigger ones, they're rarer, and then there are the smaller ones, which are about 1 to 2 meters wingspan.
Right. And then those, do both of them travel in groups, herds, pods, schools?
I think so. Yeah. Yes.
I got there. Because
I had to think as well.
Yeah, I think because, seeing these smaller mantas and seeing, dozens of them or hundreds of them, that would be a spectacle.
Yeah.
But seeing a giant manta ray and seeing hundreds, that would be, it's like Yeah, Aquaman's coming to attack or something.
Yeah.
But yeah,
It would be spectacular.
that would be. I don't know. Is there any other cool stories from your adventures?
I mean,
I want to know. I'm so interested about this. I love this.
I don't know. There's a yeah. Yeah. Hawaii was I think Hawaii is also very, very wild place. So they talk about a lot of large animals that will, use Hawaii as a beacon in the Pacific where there's nothing else. And I remember they have very sharky waters. And I remember when they have huge rainfalls, their waters get murky because they have the runoff from the river mouths, and so this brilliant clear water turns murky and brown. And I remember the locals just watching us with are you going in that water now? That's tiger shark territory. And
Right.
I remember we were loading the boat once, and just like at the harbor, and you walk, like the jetty was on one side, and you go to the other side of the jetty, and there's a tiger shark just chomping on a goat that had washed out right there. And so the guys are like, oh, well, we're not, and of course my, the head of the diving health and safety, well, we're diving that way. So we're not going this way, So it was,
Tiger sharks are they're not very friendly. They will attack. I've heard that they'll
well, if it's
attack.
murky water, they're gonna chomp without knowing what it is, right? And so
Wow.
that's what the thing is. So if you lose visibility, it immediately becomes very sharky, because
That's
sort
where
of,
they like to hunt.
yeah, exactly. They have the advantage and whatnot. So I lived on an island in Heron Island in South Great Barrier Reef, and I used to swim in the harbor, which is very, very clear waters. But it is a marine park, so there were reef sharks around, and they're not bigger than us. So it came to a point where you get used to seeing them around. But there was a bait ball at the end of the harbor where there's a wreck, and I remember maybe I should go around the bait ball when I'm doing my laps at the end of every day. But I did love swimming through it because I felt like a shark going through a bait ball. And then sure enough, there was a shark going through the bait ball, and both of us were like, and like darted in the
Wow.
opposite direction. So I learned my lesson, Yeah. When there's zero visibility, you kind of get out of the water,
Okay, noted.
Yeah.
I'll remember that one.
Yeah.
Just considering that I want to be no parts of that at all.
Yeah.
But yeah, Anjani, thank you very, very much. I saw a PhD here, so is it not doctor?
It's doctor, yes. But I would save the doctor for real doctors.
Nah, man.
Unless
Dr.
you were
Anjani
Coral,
Ganase. Yes. But thank you so much for coming. This has been super educational. I'm really, really glad that we got a chance to chat.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, when you after your next few adventures, we'll have to have you on again to see what updates you have for us.
Yes.
Thank you.
Mostly
again.
adventures in Tobago. That's been the last 5 years of
That's
my
been your
life.
focus.
Yeah.
What's the
quite a
coolest thing in
bit.
Tobago?
Oh gosh, the night diving is something that I've done a lot more in Tobago. So being in the water for 4 hours at the end, in the dark with a flashlight, can really torture your mind. But for me, it was quite soothing, getting used to like being in the dark, and it's mostly looking for coral spawning, and so I think it's pretty cool to be able to have that experience and embrace it, so
Is there more animal life
definitely.
at night?
Yes, yeah. So we don't get the big things, unfortunately, because we don't have much fish left. Northeast Tobago is known for their hammers and whatnot, but you do get the odd tarpon that will come in, or the odd barracuda or grouper that will come in at night, which is it's special because it's no longer that common.
Barracudas we used to have a lot of barracudas,
Oh
right?
yeah, the giant barracudas.
Did we fish them out?
Yeah,
Or?
the last time I saw them in good numbers was in 2010 when I did when I worked in Tobago on a turtle project. They were so scary because then you'd have like the reef that I had to get to that side of the reef, and there's a giant barracuda that's just hovering over where I needed to go. And they don't move, right? They would stand their ground, right?
Wow.
And if they move, you're kind of like,
I remember growing up, going down the islands, and people saying, "Don't swim with chains on down the
Yeah.
islands." But we don't have that issue anymore.
unfortunately,
Or do we?
not.
No, we don't.
No. My aunt was attacked by a school of barracudas on Good Friday many years ago. She had an anklet on.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, it was, people in the hospital like, it's Good Friday, you shouldn't be swimming. And so but that doesn't happen anymore. And I mean, I've been to other places where the barracudas are definitely not, they are threatening looking creatures,
Yeah.
because they would go after our bubbles, because that sort of shimmers as well.
Yeah.
So they would kind of like dart through that. But
And they're
yeah.
fast.
Yeah.
They're super fast.
Yeah.
Thank you so much again.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Take care.